Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Froebel Trust webinar this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here and to say hello to you all and see where you're from in the chat. I'm Jane Whinnett. I'm a Froebel Trust Travelling Tutor, and I'm your host for this evening. So I see that we've got people from all over UK, from quite a few from USA, from New Zealand, South Africa, from, oh my goodness, yeah, Australia, Greece. So lots and lots of people and lots of names that I recognise. So it's really lovely to see that. So, this evening, I think we're in for a really interesting and stimulating evening, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Helge Wasmuth, who's the Professor of Education at the Department of Early Childhood and Early Childhood Education at Mercy University in New York. He's author of Froebel's Pedagogy of Kindergarten and Play, Modifications in Germany and in the United States, and co-author of Finding Froebel, The Man Who Invented Kindergarten. And he's also one of my fellow co-editors of the Bloomsbury Handbook to Friedrich Froebel. So welcome, Helge, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. We're going to do, I think, maybe about 40 minutes. Just a couple of things to say. Please do say hello in the chat and, use the chat to make comments. But if you would like to ask a question, please do put that in the Q&A. And we are going to record this evening so that it will be available as a webinar on the Froebel Trust website. So, Helge, I think over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jane. Thanks so much for the introduction. And thanks to everyone who's here. I guess for most of you, it might be already Thursday evening. And I've heard you have really nice weather in the UK, which would be whether we should go outside in nature, what Froebel would probably have recommended. I am just having a thunderstorm here in New York, but it's over now. So I'm pretty sure everything will work fine. So let me share my screen. Okay, wait. Okay, so what I was thinking today when Sasha and the Froebelers asked me if I could speak about something that I have just been writing about, one of Froebel's letters that he wrote in 1846. I wanted to make a connection with some of the Froebel Trust principles and also thinking a little bit about what it means for us today as a community, why Froebelian pedagogy is still relevant. And so what I would like to do today is, so I will start by talking a little bit about why I'm interested in this topic, especially as a historian. So I'm a historian who did a lot of work on Froebel and his sources and his original writings as a historian. So I will talk about that a little bit. Then I will talk about the letter, why I think the letter is interesting and why it is important to continue to read these primary sources. We'll bring it in connection with one of the key ideas in this letter is something that Froebel called helplessness, and will relate that to one of the Froebel Trust principles, which is freedom with guidance. And then finally, as I said, I will end, and this is more like some kind of thinking workshop, because I have to start to think about these ideas for a while now, and so I'm really interested in what you will have to say and what you think about that. So I'm really looking forward to this last part, where I will think about why is it still relevant today? Why should we think with Froebel, and what can it mean for us today? So let me start with why I'm interested in this topic. So as I said, I'm a historian, and I'm always trying to go back to the primary sources. And that over the last years has led to many questions I have about the sources, which sources are used, why they are used, which sources are not used, and then also how we can access these kind of things, how we can translate it. So one of the things I'm normally trying to say at the beginning is, what I think is really important is that as at least as a historian, there's a difference, and I will talk about it a bit later, what it means for practitioners today. But I think it is important to think about what is the authentic Froebel. And just to make that very, very quickly. So the authentic Froebel means, that we try to our statements about Froebel, his ideas, that they are based on a variety of sources and not just a single source. And then especially when it comes to kindergarten pedagogy, I'm always thinking, it's more important to look at what he wrote in the 1840s and not so much what he wrote earlier, for example, in Education of Man. So the authentic Froebel doesn't mean that there's like a correct version of Froebel. That's something I would like to emphasize. I think there are different ways how we can interpret him. It's possible to make different kind of emphasis here and there, even if many of his thoughts are consistent over the years. But it really means that we're trying to look at like him as like the variety of what he was writing and base our statements and see like, is it really something that is authentic to Froebel's thinking, or is it just something he said at one point and never again? And that's the idea behind that. So as I said, I have been really frustrated with the Froebel writings and the access to it. And both regarding the German editions, but especially with the English versions. So very often you can find a reference that says like, I don't know, Froebel from 1886 in this and this book. And for me as a historian, it's always a question, yeah, well, but what kind of source is that? What are we referring here to? And that's something I started to realize over the last year. Then I got really interested into that and to think about, so why is this the case that it's so difficult, especially in the English context, to refer to Froebel's original writings? And then another question I've been thinking about for a while now is like, how can we translate Froebel? So Froebel is a really difficult thinker. His writing style is very complex, very complicated, and that makes him really, really difficult to translate. But I feel like, because, and as we can see, so many people are here today from the English-speaking context, so there is interest in Froebel. So how can we translate him in a way that is really appropriate to his complicated thinking, and that we are not losing something in these translations? So a little bit more about the editions and why it is so complicated, because that's also important for what I will say later about the letter. So it is really a mess, and I'm talking about the German editions now. There is no complete edition of his works. There are various different editions, and then other important writings, for example, are just has been published in monographies, not in editions. So it's really complicated to get an overview about these kind of writings. It's also the problem is that Froebel never wrote a book, like one specific book that's really trying to express his pedagogy of kindergarten and play. So such a work is missing. And that brings you to the question, like, where can I find his thoughts, his original thoughts, and what should I read? And as I said, it's of course a big problem that the annotated complete edition does not exist. So you need to find different editions, and you need to be aware of what is out there and not. And then also, from my perspective, there is no real agreement on what are the essential texts when we talk about kindergarten of pedagogy. If I said pedagogy of kindergarten, as I said earlier, very often people refer to Education of Man, which is of course his main work. But what are the essentials writings when it comes to kindergarten pedagogy, which were mainly written 20 years later? So to find these things, it is really tedious, but it's possible. You can find the writings, but you need to have a lot of expertise to do that already. However, talking about the English editions, it's an absolute mess from my perspective. And just to say why it is so complicated. So some of the older translations are based on two German editions. One was by Lange, one was by Pösche, but both already modified the texts. So these translations are basically already translations of modifications. And then like one of the later editions, Lily's work, she says that in the preface is like she's really changing what she's seeing to make it easier to understand. So it's really questionable if she's really quoting Froebel or translating Froebel, or if it's more like her own interpretation. Yeah, and then the last thing which I realized by looking at the different editions over the last months, and I might be wrong there, but I don't think so. I think all of the German editions since the 1980s, which are really important and really essential, have never been translated. So that brings me to the conclusion that many of you might think about a very different Froebel than I do, because I read different texts who have been, as I said, published in these editions by Erika Hoffmann in the 1980s. And these texts are simply missing for everyone who can't read German. So I think that brings this whole problematic of access to Froebel, and that's also why I think it is still important to continue to do this work to think about maybe new editions and maybe new translations. And that's also something I wanted to do with this one letter. And just as an example, what I mean with that, why it is so complicated. So this is what you can find in the principle, the Froebelian principles. You can find them on the website of the Froebel Trust, and there you can see the quote, right? It's like saying it's Froebel in Liebschner. And so for me, as a historian who's really interested in these original sources, my questions were like, so when did he write that? You know, where is this quote coming from? To whom did he write it, and why did he write it? What is the context? And is it really authentic? So these are all these questions I think are important when we want to use Froebel's original writings today. And so I looked up what Liebschner is saying, and so he went to the archives back then in East Germany. I think the archive is now probably the Staatsbibliothek, or it's a Bibliothek für Bildungsgeschichtliche Forschung. I'm not sure about that. So, but you know, it's not really helpful, as you can see. Like it says like 1845. So that's great. So it is from the kindergarten period, but still I can't say like to whom did he write it, why did he write it, and so on and so on. And this is, I think, is the problem we face very often with the English editions right now. So why this letter to Max Leidesdorf? A little bit about the context. So he wrote the letter in 1846, and at this time he had giving up living in Bad Blankenburg. So he was either traveling, so he was traveling a lot at this time, even if he was already over 60 years old. He was always going on these travel, it's like journeys to speak with people, meet new people, spread the kindergarten idea. And when he was not traveling, he was living in Keilhau, where he was more like a guest at this time. He was not in charge of Keilhau anymore. That was Barup. And especially like his family was very critical of him because he was always spending money which no one had, basically. So, but that's where he was living. And he was also in Keilhau when he wrote this letter in 1846. He had been on a journey before, but came back in, I think, New Year's Eve of 1846. He came back and was in Keilhau then. So Leidesdorf was not a friend, or it was someone Froebel had just met. Leidesdorf must have stayed in Keilhau in the summer of 1845. There are some letters later where Froebel is writing to him and talking about that. So he had been in Keilhau to learn more about Froebel's pedagogy. And so that's what Froebel did all the time around the 1840s. Like he met people, and when he saw like they could help his cause, they could support the kindergarten movement, he stayed in touch with them, wrote them letters or shared information. And that's also what he hoped from Leidesdorf. So he hoped that Leidesdorf would support his cause, that he would speak with other people, maybe then also something thinking about opening their own kindergarten. So that's what he was trying to achieve here with this conversation with Leidesdorf. So the letter, and why I choose the letter, I think the letter is really interesting because it's one of his best explanation of the law of the sphere and also of some of his educational principles. And Froebel must have realized that as well pretty quickly, because there are some more conversation where he talks about, though he sent a draft to Leidesdorf, and he was talking to Barup, can I get it back? And then he was also writing to some other people mentioning that he wrote that, and it's very interesting and very good. So I think Froebel had a really good understanding that this is something good, what he was writing. And as I said before, he had always been struggling with that, especially expressing the law of the sphere in words. So that was always an issue for him, though he was convinced that he had found that. So again, here the problem is, so there is a draft of the letter, and then there's a transcript, and then there's also an edited version that was first published by Lange in 1862, which is longer than the draft. So, you know, and I said that before, this brings you to the question, so who made this modification? Was it Froebel, or did Lange do it to make it easier to understand, but also maybe to change some things? So in my translation of the letter, I refer to the transcript from that, so that this is the second version, which is a transcript of the draft. And I'm not referring anymore to the one that was published by Lange. And you see he gave it a very long title, which makes clear already, you know, it's not a simple letter, it's more like a treatise, and it's really something he had thought about it. And so in the second version, you can find the title of that's what I'm now referring to as a letter. And again, I think it is really one of the best letters to understand many of his thoughts, especially when it comes to the law of the sphere. So that's why this letter is really good. But then he also makes some connections to anthropology, also to his education. At the end, he starts to talk about the whole of gifts and occupations and also about play care. So that's why I feel this letter is really interesting and important, because it connects many of the things that were important to Froebel and shows very good how he thinks. So how is the letter structured? So it begins with the law of the sphere, which had been on his mind for at least the last 35 years. So the first time he was writing about that was in 1810, when he left the von Holzhausen family and went to Göttingen. So in his diary here, you can find these thoughts. And it had always been on his mind for the next 35 years, had always trying to express it in a way that people can understand what he really means. And yeah, again, it's interesting. So it is in a sense very consistent to what he was writing 35 years before. It's also consistent in a way to what he's saying at the beginning of Education of Man. But here it's very concise and very brief, and I find it very easy and good to understand. And then he goes on to start with some remarks on anthropology and then on education. And again, why I find the letter really interesting. So he's using some of his key terms of the end of his life, of the early 1840s, like terms like link total or premonition, and then also the term helplessness. So these key terms are very present in this letter. And then also he makes a clear connection to the whole of the gifts and occupations. So he goes into more detail about his pedagogical ideas. And again, that's why I find the letter really, really helpful. So the key term I want to talk about today a little bit more detail is helplessness. And again, so it shows already why it is so difficult to access Froebel's work and translating it, because previously I had referred to it and used the term need for help. And I did that because I used the version that was edited by Lange, because there you can find the term Hilfsbedürftigkeit. And so I translated with need for help. And then when I worked on the transcript, I couldn't find the term anymore. And I was thinking like, okay, what's going on here? Why is this term not there? And then I realized that in the draft, so in Froebel's original writing, the term doesn't exist, and Lange probably added it in a very prominent way at the beginning of the paragraph when he talks about it. And by this, he's changing, of course, the understanding of what Froebel is talking about. I'm not saying he's incorrect, because I think what Froebel really means is more like a need for help and not really helplessness. However, it's not the term that Froebel is using in his original writing. So, and again, this, I think it shows the difficulties with that there is no annotated complete edition, and you know, depending on what kind of materials you're using, it's easy to get a different understanding of what Froebel might want to say in these texts. So how does he mean this idea of helplessness? Oh wait, no, I can't read it. Wait, give me 1 second. Okay, now it should work. Okay, so the first quote I wanted to share with you is he's saying, the helplessness in which the human child is born expresses a multiple but in itself united meaning. So why is it important? So Froebel is introducing this term, and he's clearly saying like it has some meaning, you know, it's not something that just happened without any reason. So that children are born in the state of helplessness, there's a reason for that. And then he continues to talk about that, and he's saying there are 3 different reasons for that. So one is because children are in this helplessness. It allows for education. It makes it possible that we can have education. The other idea is saying there's like, it also helps the children to realize that they are part of the whole universe, of the bigger thing. So that's this idea of the link total, that you as an individual are part of something bigger. And then that's finally also he's saying like, you know, because they are helpless, they can develop this self-power through self-activity. So he's making very clear at the beginning, like this is an important thing and it's meaningful for the children. And this is important because Froebel doesn't understand it in a sense that this helplessness is something bad or a weakness. He's seeing it as something very important. So you can see that here in this quote. It for him it's like that he uses the word helplessness doesn't mean that children are not capable of doing things or that they can't do things on their own. But it's really saying like, you know, because they have this helplessness, actually it is able for us to educate them and help them to become these conscious adults that we want them to be. And this is the idea of the whole idea of helplessness. So why do we need helplessness? So again, two quotes. The first one is again, so he's claiming because children are in this state of helplessness, it enables them to feel, to more, not really understand, but to feel more and like to sense that we are divine beings, so that we are God's creation by God, and that is very important for all of his thinking, as I will say later. And this is this whole idea of why he also created kindergarten, that people need to understand that they are divine creations and that they can live a life according to this idea. So which you can see here then now in the end. And this is a very typical Froebel quote, and I don't want to read it. And the idea at the end, you know, it's this idea of life unification. So that is what Froebel was always saying. His idea of why he created kindergarten and why we need education is that children and then adults or human beings not only understand that there is a law that is in everything, but that they also are able to live according to this law. And this is what he's calling to live a life in life unification. So it's a unification with human beings, it's a unification with nature, and then most importantly, the unification with God. And this is this whole idea of education, why we need education. That what he was constantly talking about in the 80s, 40s, he already started to talk about in the 80s, 30s, and this is this whole idea of also why he created kindergarten. So this is, I think, why it shows that this idea of helplessness is not something that shows that children are incapable of doing things. It really says like, that's why they are able, or we are able to educate them. So to think about it in today's terms, so what does it mean? So as I said, so for Froebel, children process what he called a premonition, and this is not really an understanding, it's more of a feeling of the law and the possibility of life unification. So that is something that is in all children. However, so that it can become consciousness, and that people are able to reflect on that and to really understand that they need education. Yeah. So the idea is that young children need education, that they need support, that they need stimulation, that they need an environment and everything so that they can develop in this way. And this is what he called a humane education. So humane education is in his sense something that follows this law of the sphere, has understood it, and creates an education that is aligned with that. And again, so, you know, we very often when we talk about Froebel, we talk about self-activity and all these kind of things. And this is absolutely true, of course, but Froebel also has this other side that it needs support, that it needs stimulation, and this is what we would call education today. Yeah. So I think the idea here is like, there is something within the child that they have this wish and that they want to understand. For example, he would say like they want to understand the law, but they still need the educators. They still need us as a reaction to this demand and need. So how is this idea, can it be seen in the principle freedom with guidance, which I guess most of you are familiar with, which I think is really a great principle. And I think you can find these ideas, you know, in modern language, in modern thinking. It's clearly there. Though again, you know, I'm not saying that these principles are not based on Froebel's original thinking. I'm more like interested, but where can you find it, right? And here I think it's a good example where you can see, yeah, what this principle is saying is definitely Froebelian in this sense. And I think the second quote is something, again, because very often people believe like, oh, Froebel, it's always about like following the child. True, but it's also like, doesn't mean that children can do whatever they want. And then also the last one I think is very close to this original idea, is that they need some guidance, that children need the support of the adult, that they need an adult who's thinking about what kind of support do children need at this stage of their life, and so on and so on. And then also in the last one, which I find is really, really close to what Froebel is thinking, the idea of guiding children, and that it's not about just removing barriers, but also to support them, to offer them opportunities, and that is needed, that I think a meaningful education does not only mean we follow the child, but also that we as the educators think about what children need. So yeah, I would say like it is this principle is really related to what Froebel is very often talking about. Which brings me to the last point of today's presentation. So I'm very often asked, like, so why is it relevant today? Or what do I think about what people are doing with Froebel today? And just to make that clear, I think there is a difference between working as a historian and scholar and trying to really understand the authentic Froebel. And I think that's important to do that for us as a profession, especially if we refer to Froebel so much. But then on the other side, I think what people are doing with Froebel's ideas today is a different story, and I don't think at all that people need to follow so closely what Froebel is doing. And I think the great work we can see by many of you that are here today, like Today in Practice, is a good example of that, right? That we are using these ideas today, but think about more like what can we do with it today and how can it continue to be meaningful to us? And so I have been thinking about like, but what does it mean to us? So what does it mean to us as a profession, as some kind of community? Why should we continue to think with Froebel, and how can it be done in a meaningful way? And here are a few ideas I have been playing around with. And I had the pleasure to speak with I think some of you are here today. I mean, Sasha is here today. I saw Marcella is here today. I don't know if Bushra is here today. So I met with them and we had these conversations, and it was really interesting because they all like talked about the same ideas somehow. And this is what I would like to present today to end my talk. So one thing why Froebel is still relevant. So, I mean, and I think that's clear from what I just said. So we can't expect to read or to think with Froebel to get any clear answers to all the pressing problems we are facing today. I think that would be the wrong approach, and we can't read Froebel in this way. But I think it still makes sense to think with his ideas, because it might help us to question the status quo, to think critically about what we are doing currently in the field of early childhood education, how we raise our children, how we educate our children. And it might help us to ask different questions. And that is also the fascinating thing. So when Froebel created his idea of kindergarten, he was not satisfied with the current status quo of early childhood education. He despised it and he thought it was wrong, right? And that's also his idea as a reaction to that, what he could see. And I think in this sense, Froebel is really meaningful still today, that we use his often timeless ideas to think about, what could we do differently? What do we need to change? And these kind of questions. So that's my first idea why I think that Froebel is still relevant today. The second one is I believe it is helpful because it gives us some kind of a shared vision, and then also like some kind of genuine language or in a shared language. And I think in this sense, the something like the Froebelian principles are helpful because they are they are short summaries of his complex thoughts. I mean, I'm sometimes a little bit, what I'm afraid that people believe these are principles that Froebel has created, which is of course not true, but still it's based on his thinking. Yeah. But what I want to say is, I think very often early childhood education, we as a profession, we are really struggling to speak for ourselves and to find a language. And as we all know, we use often language from psychology, and then over the last decades, we have been using all these neoliberal thinking, the whole debate about quality, accountability, testing, these kind of things. So, I think maybe by referring to Froebel, it hopefully enables us to find a stronger voice, because many of us know what's best in early childhood education and what's know is best for children. And but we need a language to express that. So I think in this sense, Froebel is also helpful. And then I think also it helps to resist the current trends. So I mean, we all know, and the global education reform movement is just like it summarizes many of the things that are coming from neoliberalism, and I talked about a few things already. And I think it's again like this, in this way, it helps us to resist these things and again ask different questions, and might to help us to say like, yeah, but this is not what we should be doing with young children, and we know young children are learning differently. And I think also in this sense, Froebel's pedagogy is still relevant today. And then lastly, and this is an idea that came up quite often, it helps to create some kind of identity and belonging and community. And again, I think we are in a field, you can already think about, there are so many different terms that describe what we are doing. So sometimes it's called kindergarten, it's teacher, it's an educator, or it's a daycare. And then, in the worst case, people are saying, oh, it's just like babysitting. So we have this issue of who we are as a profession, and then also people very often feel isolated. And again, having something like Froebelian ideas and principles and coming together and talk about these things, I feel that might be very helpful today in the world we are in right now. And also, I think in this sense, events like today and the conferences we have are very helpful, because they allow us to come together to work on our shared ideas and new visions, and develop this kind of community and identity, which is, of course, also something that Froebel had always envisioned. I mean, that was his idea, right? That we live in life unification. So, I mean, as I said, I wanted to make that not too long today, but these are some ideas I have about that, and I would really interesting to hear what you think. So, thanks so much. And as I said, I wrote about this letter. So if you are interested, and I think it will also be in the chat, please read the article. But you can, of course, now ask me any questions you would like to ask.
Thank you very much, Helge. That was a comprehensive explanation. And,
Did it, 40 minutes, as you asked me, you see?
I think the audience are stunned. We're processing, I think, from what from what you have been saying. So I mean, I'm interested in the whole translation process, because I feel a little aggrieved that I'm not able to access those original sources because I don't speak German. So obviously I have to, as many other people do, have to rely on translations. So when we get a translation like yours, when we've got, particular words, and you go into explaining those, I think that's really, really helpful. You can see the actual piece of the text, and you can see how you've translated it, and you're discussing it. So I wonder if you would like to say anything about particularly, some of the words that you've used, like link total, and maybe talk about, why you decided on those and that particular translation.
Sure. Let me start by saying, I'm and I have been pointing that out now for quite a while, right? And I don't mean that to criticize like people like
No.
you. I just want to say, to make it clear, right? I mean, this is what you have to work with, and there's nothing you can do about that. But it is, of course, and I feel like, because the Froebel world in the last 10, 15 years got so much closer again, right? And there's so much interest, and we have all these meetings, and it's great. And I think, Jane, we met the first time in Boston, right? In the US, right?
And actually, I think it was Grand Rapids.
Oh, it was Grand Rapids. Okay.
2017.
That was still like how many? I don't know, like quite a few years ago. Let's say it this way, right? So, but and I think there's all this interest, and that's why I feel like it's also more interesting, to get more to this authentic Froebel and the primary sources. And then what you said about terms like link total and how we translate them, and I think it is important that the translators who do this kind of work are conscious about what they are doing, and that they are able to justify why they use, and maybe like with what I sometimes do is, like, in a footnote, discuss what other meanings are possible. Because if we don't do that, then this ambiguity and like, you know, like, because Froebel developed his own words, right? And they have different meaning. And so, no, if you just pretend it's clear what he's saying here, I think we like reducing all the complexity and also the openness of these terms. And this, I think, is important. And it was not me who coined this idea of that you need like pedagogically bilingual to translate Froebel. And
Yeah.
then, like, you know, you need to be able to read it, of course, but then you also need to be able to understand it, because, you know, like in modern world, you can't put a Froebel text into DeepL or Google Translator, and because the AI won't understand the context, the nuances, right? And this is, I think, which makes it so complicated to translate this work, because you can't just give it to like a firm and they like translate it, because these people wouldn't really be able to work all these finesse and nuances. And that's why, you know, if you translate these texts, you should be open about why you translate certain key ideas in this way and not another one.
I think I was interested in that because, you know, I'd sort of looked at the word and kind of broke it down and thought, okay, how do I understand this word? And how do I understand your word? I mean,
You know, it's a term like link total, because the German word is Glied Ganzes, and that's a word that doesn't exist. But you could speak of Glied eines Ganzen. Yeah, so that would make much more sense in German. But Froebel obviously didn't, right? So that would be a link of a total would then be the translation of the. So, but he didn't. So, and I think because he invented this word and put these two things together, he wanted to emphasize the meaning of that, and that's, I think, what we need to respect. And that, of course, then like meaning and understandability can get lost, because I mean, but that's also the problem if you read it in the original, it is not always clear.
yeah. I think there's, for me, it's in that term, there sounds like something to do with the whole and the connection with other things. So the link comes, you know, to connect, because I was thinking, is it about part whole? You know, when you link it to the gifts, is it about, you know, the cube being an entire cube, but it's actually made of 8 little cubes, so they're part wholes?
Sure, you know, I mean, he would say like, well, that's why I developed the gift, right? Because it's also like linked totals, and that's true. I mean, that's true for him, because the gifts are not like just toys to play with. They are an expression of what he thinks is the law of the sphere, right? So by playing with these toys, you get this other thing, and that's completely, yeah. And this is like, it's this idea that you are always a link of something, but at the same time, you are the total, you know, so you are a link of humanity, but humanity is a total, but you as an individual, you are also a total. So I think that's why he put these two terms together to emphasize that you are always a link of something, but you are also the total of something.
No, it's fascinating. I find it really, really interesting. However, there are now some questions that I would like to ask you that are coming through on the question and answer. So, first, the first question is from Melissa Davies, and it says she hasn't come across the spherical law before. It's new to her. Could you explain what it means?
Okay. I find it fascinating that you have it, because I mean, it is, you know, it is, I think it is also true today very often, because this is episteme, his whole worldview, which is very foreign to us. And it, I mean, also like he is a deeply religious thinker, which is very often pushed to the side these days, or like, you know, and so that's why you don't not always find it in the texts, right? And it's also because, and then back people felt like, oh, this is so confusing, and if we bring that up, no one wants to start a kindergarten, so we better ignore that, right? While the idea is so, well, I try to explain it in as easy as I can. So the idea is that everything is created by God. And but he uses then God or law of the sphere. It's identical. So this is one, in a sense, identical. This is one law that can be found in everything. So it can be found in nature, it can be found in the whole world, but it also can be found in within us. So we are also expressions of this law. And but the human beings are the only ones who are tasked in Froebel's sense to understand that this law exists in everything. So, you know, like animals don't do that. So they are just living the law, but they are not understanding that the law is there. So human beings are the ones who are tasked to understand that this law isn't everywhere. And even more, they are tasked to live according to this law. And this is what he at the end of his life calls life unification. So it's this idea that you as an adult has not only understood this law, but you're also living a life according to this law, which is of course very esoteric thinking, you know.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you have to
yeah,
be very clear about that. This is like, yeah.
yeah. And how we interpret that now, you know, is another question, isn't it? About if you're living in a secular society with you know, variety, you know, huge number of different faiths, you know, how do you make sense of this very Christian, you know, informed view of you know, how what that it means.
I think also that makes reading him today quite interesting again. I mean, first of all, it's also about nature, right? And
Mm,
I mean, as we see right now, we are in a crisis, you know,
mm,
it's global warming, and that was also something that was clearly on Froebel's mind, because he lived also to a natural catastrophe like
mm,
the summer without what is it called in English, the summer without sun. I will say a little bit more about that in Erfurt when I do my keynote. So I mean, this is also like one idea, and then also I think like right now where we can see that democracy is falling apart. And again, this very often I think people believe like unity means like everything needs to be great and harmony. But
yeah.
actually, and I have to dig a little bit deeper into that again. Like in the 1830s, when he is in Switzerland, he writes a lot about that because he has these issues with his family, and it's not harmony. And he is actually developing this idea of that living in life unification doesn't mean that everything needs to be great, but that you work on these things.
Mm,
And you know what you said about different faiths, that also like I guess he would probably think it in this way. You know, we don't have to agree on that necessarily, and it's also
mm,
maybe good to have some tensions, but we need to find a way how we can still live together
mhm,
without everything falling apart. And that also I think makes it quite interesting to think about today.
mm. Yeah. And actually, if you take it as being um, some sort of other a force or seeing that connectedness, it works because we are all connected and we all have that impact on the planet and we all have impact on each other directly and indirectly. So it, you know, it works and on that level too. Okay, let's move on. There's a question from Beverly. She says, in an accountability heavy environment, how do we begin to effectively understand and merge the Froebelian concept of the adult serving as a sensitive guide for children without becoming overly adult directed in childhood play? So the adult serving as a sensitive guide for children without becoming overly adult directed in childhood play.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm not sure if I have a question, an answer to that. But again, as I said before, I think to ask these kind of questions is a
Mm,
more important thing, and to reflect on that, because for me there is no clear answer how that can work in each individual practice, right? But that's also why it is so important that we think about the education of educators not as a training where they will learn certain modules that they can use here and there, but that we always insist on the importance of reflection, because it is a good point that we see like, okay, but how can we avoid that it's an adult directed and right? So again, I don't know what you think, Jane, but there is no
I'm
clear.
thinking that, you know, Froebel himself wasn't all, I mean, he struggled with the idea of how much kind of guidance, you know, on an individual basis. You know, I think I was reading today about the example of, and it was in Liebschner, so hopefully he's translated it from the German. About when he first developed the gifts, and the gifts were delivered to the house, and he asked a child to come and look at the gifts, and the child was only interested in some stamps that were on the table. So Froebel, although he was disappointed the child didn't go with the gifts, he talked to the child about the stamps, and he's it says in the description that he observed the child's interests and he went with the child, but he also developed what that child was doing through singing verses to the child. So he had a sort of I guess an idea of what that child needed, what that child's interest was, and adapted his approach.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, he never envisioned the gifts in that you have to follow them in a specific way, right? Even if they are like materials that show you how you could play with it. It's not like this. His idea was like you have to play with it in a certain way.
Mm.
And that's again like saying is like, yeah, there is no one correct way how to do something, but you as an educator need to learn as much as you can about your children, right? That's why we always say like the importance of real assessment, that we know what the children are working on and what they kind of support they need, which is always individual differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's observation is absolutely key. If you don't know your children by observing them and interacting with them, it's not passive observation. It's really knowing where they are, and also your own professional knowledge.
Sure. Yeah. But that's also, I think, like today, like you can really use these materials in a way that suit your practice and ideas very well, right? It's not like after uh Froebel passed away and then there was these fights and the orthodoxy and people saying like you have to play in a certain way and it became very rigid. And this is absolutely, I don't think, what anyone should want today. And so I think that's also the great thing, because everyone can think, how could I use the blocks today in something that is meaningful for children today?
Yeah. However, I do think, Helge, you do have to put them back in the box correctly and put the lid on.
Of course.
Um,
I didn't say, yeah. No, I get your point here. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is from Carol Block. How do you, as a historian, take into account that words might have different meanings in German at that time?
Yeah, that's what I said earlier. I think you really need to be transparent about that. And I think you will always struggle and you will always make mistakes with certain words. But I think, like if there is, and that's also very often, I put the German word in parentheses when I'm not 100% sure
Yeah.
how to translate it. Because some words are like, I can't really translate them. So I put them into parentheses and always think like, this is the original German word. And yeah, sure, the words have changed meaning. And again, I think that brings us back to the difficulty that you need to really understand that you have good expertise of his episteme and pedagogy, and then you can think about how can I translate these words. Yeah, I think, as I said, I think it's a big struggle to translate someone so difficult to read and so complex. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So Rianne Ferguson's saying, I think it's the skill of the adult to balance and reflect. What is education for? Self-actualization or the skills to get a job? So it's, yeah.
Sure. I mean, very often today, at least here in the US, I have the feeling uh, the education and higher education is more like, yeah, training to get a job, right? You need your master's degree so that I can get a better position. And very often, this whole idea of, well, but it's education and we need to reflect on that is pushed to the side. And instead, there's a huge focus on what is working or not working, right? How can we? And again, I think, again, that's also why it's important to read not only him but all the other thinkers, that is not like the question, how can I help my 6-year-old become a better reader? So maybe the question needs to be like, should a 6-year-old become already a reader, or all of them, right? So I think that's what I mean with like asking different questions. I think that's why we need these thinkers, and that also like everyone needs to read and continue to read these complex thinkers so that we can reflect on what we want to be and not take everything for granted that we can see. And
I think it's
I can see that now in the US, like where I have like my students are a generation who went through the Common Core and who have only experienced this very focused on standards, testing, education. And they often think like this is what education should be, because they have never experienced anything else. So, and then this idea of, well, but maybe it shouldn't be that we really start here in the US so early with all the academics, and maybe there are other ways and more important ways, and it's getting more difficult if people have never experienced a different education.
Yeah, and then I think also, of course, depends where you are. I guess in the States, each state is slightly different, I believe, in their education systems, the way that it's set up. But also when we look at the diversity of the audience that we have here today, also there you've got a huge diversity of cultural contexts that people are working in. So actually, you can't say that there's one, this is going to work in this situation. But I think what you also said about thinking with Froebel is really thing. It's not about, as you said, looking to Froebel for the answers to a current day, but actually thinking with him, I think can throw new light on some of our dilemmas that we have. I'm also interested. I'm getting picky with the words, and I'm interested when you use the word humane education and not human education. Because for me, there's a distinction there between humane education has an element of compassion in it. And I wonder if that's actually what is meant, or is it just about you are a human and you're learning to be more of a human through education? Because as a human, education is something that's different for you, like you said earlier on. But humane is like, is it always kind? Is it always compassionate? So for me, and I don't know, is it the same word in German, or is it a different word? And why have we got humane education?
So he uses also sometimes different words, but he uses very often menschlich, which means human or humane. And I recall that I was thinking about which one I should use, you see, and I didn't make that explicit, and I probably should have. But I remember that I remember exactly this question: should I write human or humane? And then for me, I felt like humane is more what he means here. But as you just now pointed out, that's not clear. So that's again my point, that I should have been clear about that, because it is an important distinction, right? So for me, what he means with that is like that it's not about it's like that it follows the law, that it only a real education is a humane education, but that means like that you follow the law of the sphere, and only such an education can be a humane education. That's I think how he that's how he but it's also his problems, of course. He's never systematic about that, right? So it's
Okay.
like that he's defining this word, but in this sense, like when he speaks of a menschliche Erziehung, I would say like it's like that it means like it needs to follow the laws, but maybe then human would have been the better translation. Yeah, I don't. That's where my struggle begins, as not being a native speaker in English. Okay, maybe you are right. It's the wrong translation.
Okay. I see a question in the chat. It's saying Helge is Helge planning to create a complete annotated work of Froebel in English?
Absolutely not. I mean,
You wouldn't have a life long enough, would you, Helge?
well, if someone finds a sponsor who would sponsor a team of us, that we can work on that for the next 10 years, and then we can think about that. That's I mean, that's like if you look at the letters that are now like online, all the letters, right, in the German letters. This was, I think, a project over 10, 15 years at a university in Germany that was sponsored. And I think that's, again, what I think, and I mean, let me say it this way, what I think might be doable and might be a good idea, again, in a team, is to agree on maybe 10 something like 10 essential texts that have not been maybe translated, you know, and to agree on that. But to translate, I mean, to translate all of Heman, he wrote so much. This is like impossible, right? But I think that might be an idea that's worthwhile to consider, that group of us decides like these are good texts that need to be translated, and then one might think about that. I think that might be interesting to do.
Okay, well, I think we better wrap up. I think we'll continue the conversations, hopefully, well, at the International Froebel Society conference in Erfurt in July, and I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to meet online. So thank you so much, Helge, and thank you for answering all the questions.
I hope to see many of you in Erfurt in 2 months.
Thank you.
Thank you.